Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Our topic today is the audio-lingual method. The audio-lingual method is different from the previous methods that we have studied, and I'll explain the difference in the coming explanation. First, the audio-lingual method, or from the title, we understand that it emphasizes oral skills. Audio for auditory, the auditory skills of listening, and lingual for the lingual skills of speaking. So from the beginning, we understand that this method of language teaching gives great emphasis to language production or to oral production, to oral skills, listening and speaking. Introduction. The audio-lingual method was widely used in the United States and other countries in 1950s and 1960s. After the development of linguistics as an independent science. This is the difference. For the first time, we have a method in which we have a theory of language. So the audio-lingual method includes two theories, a theory of language and a theory of learning. After the development of linguistics as a science, we have the development of linguistic theories that try to explain what is language. The first linguistic theory introduced was structural linguistics, and I'll explain what is meant by structural linguistics in the detail of the approach of the audio-lingual method. Previously, we said that any method consists of approach, design, and procedures. The first thing to start with is approach, because everything in the method is based upon the principles of theory of language and theory of learning in the selected approach. The approach of the audio-lingual method includes two theories, theory of language, which is structural linguistics, and theory of learning, which is behaviorism. Here we need to understand what is meant by structural linguistics and what are the principles of structural linguistics, number one. Number two, what is meant by behaviorism as a learning theory or theory of learning, and what are the principles of this theory. That's why we will go to discuss the details of these two theories. The first theory that we start with is structural linguistics as a theory of language. In structural linguistics, we have two main principles. Number one, language is fundamentally oral. This means that we emphasize the spoken medium of language or oral skills of language, that is listening and speaking, more than written skills. Structural linguists believed that since we start to speak the language before we start reading and writing it, so first we should learn language orally and then we learn the written form of language. That's why they emphasize the oral form of language before the written form. This is number one. Number two, language is like pyramid because the small pieces combine to make larger units. What's meant by this? In structural linguistics, language is described as a system of structurally related elements for the coding of meaning. What's meant by this? This means that language consists of units, and these units are linked together according to structures. What's meant by units? The units of language are phonemes, morphemes, words, phrases, clauses, sentences. These units are linked together to make or to form language. For example, phonemes are put together to make morphemes. Morphemes make words. Words combine to make phrases. Phrases are put together to make clauses and sentences. According to structural linguistics, language is analyzed into different levels. These levels include phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. In these different levels, we have units, and these units are put together to form language. So, as I mentioned, we have phonemes, morphemes, words, and words combine to make phrases, phrases put together to make clauses and sentences. This is the idea of structural linguistics. That's why we have a great emphasis upon structure, because they think that language consists of units which are linked together according to structures. And since the audio-lingual method is based upon the principles of structural linguistics, number one, it emphasizes oral skills. And number two, it emphasizes grammatical structures. That's why we will find the a lot of drills in the audio-lingual method. In this case, or this is because the importance given to grammatical structures, because they think that language consists of units and these units are linked together according to grammatical structures. Now we come to the second element in the approach of audiolingualism, which is behaviorism. Behaviorism is a psychological theory which explains human external behavior in terms of stimulus-response reinforcement. What's meant by external behavior? It means the explanation of human behavior or observable behavior that others can see and observe. So any behavior which is done by human being is explained according to stimulus-response reinforcement. The audiolingual method of language teaching is based on behaviorism. It is based on actually observed behavior. In behaviorist view, learning of different activities is based on stimulus-response reinforcement. Before I explain the idea of stimulus-response reinforcement, we need to know that we have two types of behavior as human beings. We have linguistic behavior and non-linguistic behavior, which are known as verbal behavior and non-verbal behavior. So both are explained in the same way according to stimulus-response reinforcement. What's meant by stimulus, response, and reinforcement? First, a stimulus is that which can elicit, stimulate, or trigger some kind of behavior from an organism. What's meant by this? This means that if you feel thirsty, you go to drink some water. So here we have a stimulus, which is feeling thirsty, and the response that you have done, which is drinking water. So here we have a behavior which is explained according to stimulus and response. So anything or any behavior which is done by a human being needs or is a response to a stimulus. We have a particular stimulus to which the human being responds. The response is the immediate reaction of the organism to stimulus. What is meant by organism? It means the living being who reacts, who produces the response. Here we are talking about human beings, our behavior. We try to explain our behavior. So the organism is a human being in the case of our lecture today. We have a connection between stimulus and response. Whenever we have the same stimulus, we have the same response. So whenever you feel thirsty, you drink water. Whenever you feel hungry, you have something to eat, and so on. Whenever someone greets you, you respond. In this case, when we produce the same response to the same stimulus frequently, this will be developed into a habit. What is meant by a habit? The habit is the frequent association between the same stimulus and the same response. Again, our habits are linguistic habits and non-linguistic habits. Linguistic habits and non-linguistic habits. So when someone says, "Hi, how are you?" you might say, "Fine." So this is natural response, which is done frequently. That's why we have a linguistic habit. A linguistic habit. Our habits are either linguistic or non-linguistic. Reinforcement. When we produce the response, this response is either appropriate or inappropriate. So reinforcement serves to make the response as being appropriate or inappropriate. Number one, according to reinforcement, we understand if our response is correct or incorrect, appropriate or inappropriate. If the response is appropriate, it will be provided with reinforcement or encouragement. In this case, it will be repeated again. But if the response is inappropriate, it will not be provided with reinforcement, or it will be provided with negative reinforcement to the extent that this response will not be produced again. We understand that what we have done is not acceptable, is inappropriate to the situation. In this case, we will not repeat the response again. So, reinforcement is important in identifying or indicating whether the response is appropriate and it should be repeated, or inappropriate and it should not be repeated in the future. According to this, there are two possible conditions. Number one, in the case of language learning, I'll give you an example. When the teacher explains certain material, for example, the teacher asks the students a question. What is the opposite of big? If the students answers the question correctly by saying the opposite of big is small, in this case, the response is appropriate and it will be positively reinforced. So the teacher says, yes, that's correct, thank you very much. In this case, whenever we ask the student the same question, he will repeat the same answer. He will understand that this is the correct answer. But if he produces a different answer or incorrect answer, the teacher indicates that the answer is inappropriate, and in this case will provide no reinforcement or says, no, that's not the correct answer, which is considered as a negative reinforcement. The learner will understand that it is not appropriate and they are not the learner will not likely to repeat the same answer in the future. What do we call